to the History of University Life seminar. My name is Julia Horne and I'm Professor of History at the University of Sydney and co-convener of History of University Life with my colleague Dr. Matthew Thomas. And I want to begin with some Gadigal words that I think capture a really lovely sentiment. Gini Galawangan Mari Bujari Gadanurada. We meet together on the very beautiful Gadi country. Of course, we're meeting virtually. Nonetheless, they are, of course, beautiful words. And in doing so, I wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I broadcast today, and to pay respect to Gadigal elders past and present, wherever in Australia we may be today. As we share knowledge, may we also remember that knowledge has long been embedded within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander custodianship of country. Now, this online seminar is brought to you by, to give it its full name, History of University Life Sydney Research Seminar in Higher Education, which began in 2008 as a face-to-face forum, those were the days, to discuss the role of universities in Australian life from both a contemporary and historical viewpoint. Embedded in our practice is that just as the present might illuminate the past, so can the past illuminate the present. And in our seminar, we like to bring together many disciplines to explore topics to help us better understand universities. Today, we have historians of higher education and of schools, analysts and policy experts, as well as a neuroscientist. And all I can say is that we need their expertise in these days because universities are back in the news. In a keynote address to the Higher Education Summit that was held only last month, the Federal Minister, the Honourable Alan Tudge, said that after investigating university accounts, he has determined that public universities are financially strong enough without the need for further government support. Unlike, he pointedly added, private higher education providers. And then just this week, on Monday, the Centre for Future Work released a report on the impact of COVID on employment in the tertiary sector, which concluded that during the 12 months to May this year, total tertiary education employment fell by more than any other non-agricultural sector in Australia's economy. Furthermore, over 90% of these positions were full-time, with most losses in public university. So it makes, perhaps we can all collectively shake our heads about whether Australian universities and governments might ever again have constructive conversations about the place of universities in our society. But perhaps before we give up hope, today we have 4 guests on our panel who'll introduce us to some key moments in education where governments have looked to define their relationship to our public universities in one way or another. Gwilym Croucher is Senior Lecturer and Higher Education Analyst in the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, and he's also co-author of a recent book published by NewSouth titled Australian Universities, A History of Common Cause, which explores the place of universities in Australia since the early 20th century, including their relationships with government. We also have Helen Proctor, who's Professor in Education History and Policy in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work, and whose recent book is A History of Australian Schooling, co-authored with Craig Campbell. Following is James Waghorne, an historian of higher education in the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, another lockdown city at the moment, and who writes on many aspects of 20th century university life. And he's also co-author with Gwilym of this wonderful book, Australian Universities. Finally, Professor Alan Pettigrew is a neuroscientist, former Vice-Chancellor and CEO at the University of New England, and the inaugural CEO back in the early 2000s, I think, of the National Health and Medical Research Council. Now, there's much to get through in the next 55 minutes, as usual. We'll begin with presentations with the final 10 to 15 minutes devoted to questions. So do please use the Q&A function for questions, and you can start putting your questions in as soon as you want. Then they're there for the end and we will come to them. So now to the presentations. And first is Melbourne Higher Education Analyst, Gwilym Croucher, who will briefly explore why most of our universities are truly public universities. So over to you, Gwilym.
Thanks. We often talk about most Australian universities being public universities. What we mean by this is not always clear, and it often goes uninterrogated. Using the label public for Australian universities has been really to highlight the different elements of the legal and social basis of these institutions. They produce public goods, they teach students, all things we're familiar with. But they've also frequently been able to levy their own fees and exclude who it is that attends, who comes. So what distinguishes them from private clubs? All the original Australian universities were established by acts of parliament for their local communities, with a hint about the thinking often in the name. A university for Sydney and Melbourne, Adelaide, Tasmania, Queensland, Western Australia. So in this sense, the original universities were public by definition. According to the Founding Act of the University of Sydney, it would not be able to dissolve itself unless with the approval of the Governor and Executive Council of the colony. It was an institution, a body politic and corporate, whose existence relied on the government as representative of the people of the public. Now, this is, of course, a partial misrepresentation, especially in the early days, but it does pick up on common assumptions about how and why public universities in Australia are in fact public. It is baked into their origin and their founding legislation. We bring powerful assumptions about what it is that a public entity should do in this regard, assumptions about who and how should be able to access university and what it does and does not do. Now, this is not the whole story. Turning to the University of Sydney, from the first, in its founding legislation, it was able to levy its own fees. Quote, it shall be lawful for the professors or teachers of said university to demand and receive from students such reasonable fees for attendance of their lectures. Now, we could accept private benefaction as well, while retaining discretion over who was admitted. Now, doesn't this not set it up as a private club? And suggests that the University of Sydney and the other universities that followed were not, and certainly not private clubs as they developed over time. Now, this comes as much as anything from expectations held about them and how they are treated by public and government alike in meeting these expectations. Australian universities have always received significant public funding, though this has ebbed and flowed in its generosity. They have in effect been owned and supported by the public, despite their capacity to seek private contributions. They've been supported by the government in times of financial distress, such as during the Great Depression, where, for example, the South Australian Parliament ensured funds were available to the University of Adelaide, through what is now called the Waite Agricultural Research Institute. I might add, the New South Wales government, as did some other state governments, did not provide for their local universities at the time. Another example. So prior to the conclusion of the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme in the late 1940s, the government commissioned the head of the Commonwealth Education Office, Richard Mills, to review the support needed to ensure the universities were financially sustainable. Now, this review would spur on a public conversation about Australian universities and also lead to several other major reviews in the subsequent decades that built the current Australian university system, sort of built the foundations for it. Their legal and funding basis has not always been the thing that has defined them as public. There frequently have been recognition that as significant public institutions, they're less to be managed and more to be embraced and to be utilised for different needs of the various constituencies in Australia. They've been called on to assist with addressing national challenges, such as when professors and staff of the University of Queensland helped lead the eradication of prickly pear, invasive cactus that by 1919 had consumed 10.5 million hectares of grazing and farming land in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales. Now, there are also institutions for which the government and public feel fully justified in intervening in when the need arises, and we might talk about this a bit later. Now, there are many episodes we might invoke to show the publicness of Australian universities, but I'll finish on a perennial issue that has often come to frame how we think about them as public, and that is the question of who can go. The terms of admission and support have been central to the debate over public universities in Australia. You can see this from the controversy in the earlier 20th century about the enrolment in university that wasn't in your home state, to the High Court challenge or challenges to the Commonwealth government's legal right to exclude people during the Second World War, to Whitlam's policy of free to student education in the 1970s and the huge legacy that that's had. So even when they haven't acted like it, they've never been fully seen, even when they have acted like it, they've never been fully seen as private clubs. The Australian public has always asserted ownership over its universities. Now, universities have rarely been perfect in how they've met expectations, and in some sense, it's a work in progress and probably will remain so. But Australia's public universities being public is a feature that is unlikely to go away anytime soon.
Thank you, Gwilym. Now, in what you say, there can be times when there's an uneasy tension between the assumed independence of universities, yet also government expectations of them as public institutions. So I just wonder if you can give some examples.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, the universities are certainly institutions which, as I said in the presentation, that government and public really feel fully justified in intervening in their affairs at times. And while we, could call on many different examples, one I'd probably highlight is some events during the Cold War that some of us may be familiar with. And this is really where government did seek to intervene in affairs in some quite particular ways. So, for example, in 1949, ASIO made an assessment, the newly established ASIO made an assessment of the University of Melbourne and named 63 staff members as constituting a security risk. And this was really based on some pretty tenuous and in some cases demonstrably false evidence about their private political beliefs. And there are many other prominent cases we might look at, but I'll just quickly pick up on one, and that's the one of that's the case of Dick Mackinson. Now, he was a physicist who also happened to be a member of the Communist Party in Australia. In 1939, he was appointed an assistant lecturer in physics at the University of Sydney, and he certainly didn't make his political beliefs and his ultimate membership of the Communist Party, secret to anybody. He was subject to security assessments, as many people were at the time who were working in this area. And in 1946, the director of Commonwealth Intelligence Service, which would later become ASIO, he made some recommendations to the Commonwealth Solicitor General to speak to the University of Sydney Vice-Chancellor to not appoint Mackinson to the chair of physics, which was rumoured to be happening here. And indeed, he was passed over for the position, which went unfilled. This certainly wasn't the end of the story. Mackinson was passed over for a position in Adelaide in 48 and then a second time in Sydney a little bit later than that. And, it was quite a public intervention came in 1952 when the member for McKellar, Bill Wentworth, who was quite a character, publicly accused Mackinson of a whole lot of stuff. There are a number of other examples during the Cold War, Philip Ward and others, Thomas Kaiser, another physicist. And I think these are quite good examples of how, the private political beliefs of a professor are seen to be everybody's business. And that really does say something about universities as an institution and how they're viewed. They're institutions often asked to do things that the public have a great interest in, and rightly so. But they're also institutions where people feel they can intervene.
Thank you, Gwil. And of course, Bill Wentworth was also a descendant of William Charles Wentworth, who was one of the founders of this university. So perhaps he felt he had even more ownership of it. Now, to take up this notion of public education, we have Helen Proctor, Sydney Professor in Education, History and Policy, who will speak on a key moment in history in 1912, so over a century ago, when the New South Wales government decided to more firmly assert the idea of university as part of the state's public education system. So over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Julia. In the late summer of 1912-1913, a new public high school was established in Parramatta on the western outskirts of Sydney. State high schools were rare in Australia at that time, and the school's early progress was followed closely by the local press. Parramatta High School, exclaimed one report, would become the Oxford of Australia. Another described it as the People's School, contrasting it with older local non-government providers of secondary education in the district. Schools and schooling so thoroughly saturate our lives in the 21st century that it seems hardly possible that a local high school could be a novelty. The establishment of Parramatta High was part of an ambitious program of public secondary school expansion by the New South Wales Department of Public Instruction, one of 6 regional high schools founded during 1912-13, along with others at Grafton, Wagga, Orange, Bathurst, and Goulburn. All too aware of a failed attempt to expand public high schools into regional New South Wales in the 1890s, the state government's strategies to ensure success included a public relations campaign which emphasised the place of the high school in a new public educational ladder of opportunity. The image of a meritocratic educational ladder continues to have resonance in public discourse, associated with different kinds of assessments and analyses of how Australian education operates. Raewyn Connell satirically argued in the late 20th century that, and I'm quoting here, "The best advice we can give to a poor child keen to get ahead through education is to choose richer parents." At the time of Parramatta's founding, it would be decades before Aboriginal children had legal rights to set foot on the ladder by enrolling in public schools. Children with disabilities were conventionally excluded, as were young people who were categorised as delinquent, one way or another, to use the language of the time. In the 1910s and 1920s, the New South Wales educational ladder was celebrated by its architects and supporters as exemplary nation building by a progressive and enlightened state. The public education system was represented visually in line diagrams and photo essays as a map of different kinds of state education institutions articulated hierarchically from the smallest country elementary school at the bottom to the Sydney University at the top. The imagery was intended to concretise both efficiency and fairness. The ladder was considered efficient in the sorting by the state rather than the family, the church, or private interests of children and young people into their best suited pathways. The fairness question was directed at 2 main problems: providing equality of provision in the country as well as in the city, and to all children, no matter the social class, wealth, or connections of their parents. The people are the state. The children are the state's as well as the families. It pays the state to educate her future citizens, offered one 1927 assessment by an academic at the Sydney Teachers College. According to its supporters, the establishment of Parramatta and other schools like it meant that it would now be, and I'm quoting again, "within the privilege of every parent to give his boy or girl an education that would lead the child right to the doors of the university." Parramatta High School, explained one local commentator in 1914, offers an opportunity for ambitious boys and girls such as they have never had before in this district. The university, the professions, the public service are all within reach. The special aim of the school is to help students qualify for them. All that is required is grit and self-sacrifice on the part of the pupils and their parents. Part of the contract being proposed for parents was to accept the system's decision about how far their child should progress and to support them financially if they persisted at school beyond employment age. The high schools remained free of charge, except for a brief backlash in the 1920s. The idea that any but a handful would make a journey through secondary schooling to university was still decades in the future. In Australia, high school completion rates did not move over 50% until the 1980s, and the numbers of ex-Parramatta High University students were so tiny in the 1910s that their successes were described case by case in the local newspaper. There was plenty of well-paid work to be had, especially for young men, that did not require either high school or university credentials.
Thank you, Helen. And as the daughter of someone who actually went to Parramatta High, I think he'd be turning in his grave at the moment to see it, to think that it was described once as the Oxford of Australia. But perhaps he didn't have enough grit or self-sacrifice, or didn't make enough self-sacrifice to really enjoy the surrounds. But as you've hinted, entry to university was to be determined by examination in particular subjects. So those who passed the exam were admitted to university. I wonder, what is different today? Should entry to university still primarily be based on academic merit? Is this a debate that we should be having? Indeed.
Thanks, Julia. Look, I've got a couple of things to say about that. And one is a sort of fundamental skepticism about the idea of academic merit in itself. In the education sector, I mean, schools are terribly guilty of this. I was a school teacher for a number of years before I became an academic. We're constantly telling people and ourselves about what we're good at. We think we can measure, we can calibrate how good we are at whatever it is that we're measuring. And we often have quite a narrow range of what we consider to be, the sort of desirable skills. And certainly at, some of the early criticisms of the public high schools were that, that they would turn us into a sort of nation of pen pushers, and that they valued these sort of pen and paper skills at the expense of the trades, as they would say at the time. So I think that is a problem, that the way we measure. I don't have such a problem with examinations, although most people in my field do. But I think the fundamental problem is our misplaced confidence that we know what academic merit is, and that we can, diagnose it with a great deal of finesse. And one of I did a lot of oral histories. I did a study of Parramatta High School for my PhD a number of years ago, and I did a lot of oral histories and with these amazing people. But one of the things that made me a bit sad was that all these people had been academically selected one way or another to go to this school. But they all had these stories about themselves as clever or not clever. And I remember interviewing this fabulous woman who had gone on to become the principal of a local commercial college, for secretarial college. And she said, oh, well, I wasn't as clever as some of them because I wasn't in the Latin class, and everyone sort of knew that the Latin class were the really clever ones, and she'd maybe been in the C class or something like that. And those kinds of things, as a former school teacher, made me very sad that we're, sending people these messages. So that's one part of the answer, is that I'm skeptical about academic merit. The second part is that I wonder if we need to think more expansively about this whole idea of university entrance, and to think about what are the purposes of controlling people's access to certain courses in certain ways. I mean, I know there's a sort of fundamental question of supply and demand, but can we think more creatively or more expansively beyond those ideas of X number of places of provision and Y number of places that want to access that provision? So that's probably what I have to say.
Well, it sounds very good to me. So thank you very much, Helen. And moving right along, we now have historian of higher education, James Waghorne, who questions this idea of common cause amongst universities. So they may be public institutions with public expectations and responsibilities, but are universities naturally aligned with one another simply because they are public institutions? So over to you, James.
Thank you, Julia. The central idea we sought to tackle in our book, Australian Universities, was the question of what affiliation universities had with one another. To what extent did organisationally independent universities, with distinct governing legislation enacted by state governments and complex internal governing structures, have common cause? Could they be seen to be Australian? This might not seem to be a controversial statement today, as we have lived almost 50 years under fully Commonwealth funding structures, pushing universities ever closer towards a unified model. Yet universities remained embedded in their communities as civic institutions, to take the formulation of Marginson and McIntyre. Professors and other academics, meanwhile, maintained their own international networks within their disciplines, as has been described by Tams and Peach. This meant that universities were simultaneously international and local, but much less national. The idea that universities had some kind of national aspect was one that divided university figures at the beginning of the 20th century. There were few national conferences and fewer reasons to meet. This began to change during the First World War, as structures were created to survey and engage universities across the British Empire, leading representatives of the then 6 state universities to convene annual national university conferences from 1920, and then to form the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee in 1934, an organisation which since 2007 has been known as Universities Australia. These meetings brought together believers in this form of national interaction. But the idea was certainly not universally supported. The Sydney Morning Herald editorialised against the University of Sydney participating in 1920 for its potential to waste resources and bring divided loyalty. The universities were, quote, widely different, it argued. Almost 50 years later, when he started as secretary of the AVCC in 1966, Frank Hambley lamented that the organisation was, quote, a body with no voice, repeating another headline from the Sydney Morning Herald, referring to the AVCC's lack of standing to speak on behalf of all universities. And this has been the pattern for centralisation. Where there are benefits to combining, universities have seized them, but they have remained self-governing state organisations. So what was it that drew universities together? It is a common shorthand to view the role of the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee in negotiating with the Commonwealth Government, and its long campaign to expand Commonwealth funding in particular. Yet, universities were cautious about this idea. When the Commonwealth provided universities with special research funding in 1935, universities such as Melbourne lobbied privately to ensure that it would not compromise their existing, more lucrative state government research funding. As Hannah Forsyth has shown, following the Second World War, while the AVCC was lobbying post-war governments collectively for resources for staff, equipment and research that all fell under the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, the University of Sydney was making separate arrangements with both state and Commonwealth governments. If you had asked participants in the early conferences what they were seeking, they might have answered something like fellowship, and the masculine connotations of this word are appropriate. That is, they shared a desire to extend the hand among peers and meet privately, in the same way as other associations, ranging from the Royal Societies to the Round Table. Out of meeting and correspondence, other outcomes would surely follow. And the meetings produced efforts to correlate and coordinate university operational matters. They shared information about things such as staff tenure, the fees they charged government and industry for testing in university laboratories, the rate their academics charged for contributions to broadcasting. This kind of benchmarking, as it might be styled today, has continued helping to inform policies set by universities themselves, but also government and accrediting agencies. Universities also cooperated in arrangements for the National Forestry School in Adelaide and then Canberra, and the creation of the University College in Canberra. Perhaps the most remarkable example of cooperation was the National Chair of Anthropology, established by the University of Sydney in 1925, with financial contributions from all of the other universities. This kind of soft engagement has typified the connection between Australian universities. Where common cause has been found, it has been very often for specific purposes, and it is not always to be relied upon. Thank you.
So thank you, James. I wonder if, what have been some other ways in which universities, or perhaps, it's better to say the people within them, have formed a national connection around a common cause?
So thanks, Julia. I think that's something that we really tackled in the second half of our book. The AVCC has provided one model of national connection, but there have been others. For example, the National Union of Australian University Students, established in 1937, took up issues common to students, ranging across student welfare to living standards and support for Indigenous Australians. Similarly, staff also have established their own kind of national connections. A Federal Council of Australian University Staff Associations was established in 1952 to advance causes of interest to academic staff, including academic freedom, but also to posit a kind of different locus of authority within a university, to show that universities are a bit more complex than we might imagine if we just think about the leaders at the very top of organisations. So Eric Ashby and Mary Anderson argued that way back in 50 years ago, argued that we should view universities as being comprised of estates, different classes within them, who each had a role in determining policy and shaping its identity. And I think that in Australia, we've seen that these different estates, if you like, students, staff, leadership, have all played a part in forming these kinds of tenuous, perhaps, national connections between universities. And I think it reminds us that we should think more deeply and more carefully about what we imagine when we think about universities, that they have these different interests within them.
Thank you. Thanks very much, James. Finally, we have Alan Pettigrew, an experienced university and research leader and administrator who's recently turned his eye to understanding how the funding of university research in Australia has changed over the last 25 years. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. May I first acknowledge the Gadigal people from whose lands I'm speaking to you, and their elders past, present and emerging. In the context of the history of Australian universities that Gwilym and James have so elegantly shared with us in their book and today, I'd like to reflect on the history of funding for university research in the sector over the last 3 decades. I'm old enough to remember a period in the 1990s when there was a grave concern and much political lobbying for an increase in funding for fundamental research in universities, particularly from the medical research community. As a result, and as shown in my first slide, Commonwealth funding for the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council that underpins most of the investigator-initiated research in our universities was increased over about 10 years from the early 2000s. Subsequently, up to 2019, funding for these grants has either stabilised in the case of the NHMRC or declined somewhat in the case of the ARC. Not surprisingly, as funding levels increased through the middle period shown here, so the number of research-only staff in universities also increased, and in fact doubled over these years. As a consequence, and as our researchers of today well appreciate, there is now once again enormous competitive pressure in securing highly prized and reputable NHMRC and ARC grants for university research. There have also been changes in other areas of external funding for research in universities, as shown in my next slide. The blue bars in this figure show there has been growth between 2000 and 2010 and again after 2016 in other government funding that is aligned with government priorities of the day. The orange bars show a continued increase in industry funding, and it is now the second most valuable source of funding for research after the competitive grants shown in my previous slide. And finally, the yellow bars show the relatively low levels of funding for cooperative research centres. Whilst closer alignment of research with government and industry priorities is important, we must not underestimate the importance and the need for improved support for longer-term fundamental research through the Commonwealth competitive grants shown earlier. However, all this funding for research does not cover the full costs of research. To help cover these costs, especially in regard to Commonwealth competitive grants, the government has for a long time provided all universities with an annual research block grant. The size of each grant is currently determined from each university's relative success in attracting external research funding from the sources I've just mentioned and graduating research students. This is a fundamental principle of the so-called unified national system of funding for Australian universities, whereby all universities are funded on the same competitive basis. But even with the financial support of the research block grants, there is a shortfall in the level of funding for research that our universities regard as essential to their missions. Consequently, universities utilise a proportion of their own financial resources to support their research effort. Data from the Department of Education, Skills and Employment over the period 2006 to 2018 show that across the sector as a whole, between 53% and 56% of total university expenditure on research has been sourced from what are termed general university funds. The data for individual universities in 2018 are shown in my last slide. Here, each data point represents the relationship for each university between their expenditure of internal funds on research on the horizontal axis and their total expenditure on research on the vertical axis. The line shows that on average, internal funds account for 56% of total expenditure on research. These internal general university funds are sourced from a variety of revenues. These include, up until recently, an allowable proportion of Commonwealth funding for student places, as well as things like investment income, asset management, and of course, international student fees. Indeed, there is a strong equivalence between total international student fee income across the sector and total general university funds expenditure on research. To conclude, there are now several factors that have the potential to impact future research in Australia's universities. Perhaps the most significant is the long-term impact of COVID on international student fee revenues and the limitation of the extra government support for COVID in research block grants to just this year, 2021. However, added to this is the impact of recent changes to funding for student places, including the loss of the component of Commonwealth funding for each domestic student place that was allowed for research, and the redistribution of funding across the various disciplines. So Julia, I think these and other factors place us at a critical point in time today for the future of research in the Australian university sector.
So thank you very much, Alan, for that presentation. And I wonder if you could, what you're describing is that we're actually at a juncture in how Australian research is funded, it seems to me. So you mentioned the increasing significance right at the end of your paper of international student fees as a source of revenue, which of course we hear much about in the press. So I wonder if you can perhaps just describe the importance of this revenue to the current funding of research in Australia, and how might shortfalls be replaced if international students actually don't return in the same numbers that they were here just a few years ago?
Well, thanks, Julia. I think that's a hospital pass in some respects. When you say a juncture, I think it's actually the beginnings of a perfect storm for all the complex factors which I mentioned earlier, not only international student fees, but all the redistribution of funding amongst student places, etc. It's all very complicated, and it's going to be quite a challenge for universities to work that through. But going to the international fee versus research issue, perhaps Peter, if you could put up that extra figure. This is a graph which I've prepared, which shows on the orange bars show the total international student fee income across the whole sector from 2004 to 2018, and you can see the rise which has been going on there. The blue bars are the total general university funds for research, which all the universities together expend on their research from their own internal resources. And I think the parallels between these two sets of bars reveal quite starkly how much international student fee is important for supporting research. And as you'll see, it's not until about 2016 or 2018 where the orange bar actually exceeds the height of the blue bar, which tells me that universities have been spending a lot of their international student fees to support research, and they've had to use other funds to get the blue bars above the orange bars. But the situation is now reversed. And I think that coincides with the period when international student fee numbers are now so very, very high that some of these resources needed to be put into other functions such as student support and indeed into the teaching programs that are going on. So I think that relationship pulls it out pretty clearly what the dangers are going forward. And I think the international student fee issue is not going to affect every university in the same way. We've already seen some evidence of that. So I think we're in for a pretty rocky road if student numbers don't come back. And the other issue there is that even if they came back quickly next year, the long-term effect of 2 years of interference in the system, if I could put it that way, is going to be there's going to be a long time to recover back to where we were before. What do we do about replacing that? I've got no idea, Julia, really no idea. The only comment I would make is that going on from what James was talking about in terms of cooperation and state systems, I'd be advocating for universities to be working closely together to maximise each of their own capacities, but also sharing a lot. And there might be different ways of doing that, and we might need some incentives to encourage that. But that's where I think it's going.
Thank you, Alan. We're now going to move to Q&A because we've got actually some questions coming through. And the first question is, what are your thoughts? Now, this is a very Sydney question, I might say, but I think there's also a Melbourne answer here. But it's, what are your thoughts on the new Vice-Chancellor's view, this is at the University of Sydney, that both our university and UNSW need to work together more, especially to garner support from state government for research funding and infrastructure. And this was a view that was appeared in the press, I think just last Friday. And Alan, you actually, in some ways, just answered that. So it sounds, so anyway, I might just open it up first to Helen and Alan to talk about that sort of cooperation, and then in more general terms to James and Gwil. But if we could just keep the answers brief so we can get through the other questions.
Helen first.
Sure. Look, I think that part of the, I don't want to use a cliched word like neoliberalism, but I do think that the perils of market competition, you know, in the university and the school sector have been very evident in a number of effects, and certainly anything that is able to work against that, I think is most welcome. Whether it's possible is probably a question more for the university experts on this panel than me.
Alan, do you want to add anything?
Well, look, I do. I think we've really got to engage with state governments and federal government to work out what's the best way to organise cooperation between locally based institutions and even more distantly based institutions. And I've often thought about the idea of, do we need state-based networks of universities where the state government has a much more influential role over bringing its state's universities together and working up partnerships between them and reducing this competitive barrier which is there amongst the unified national system. All universities are competing so hard to get as much as they can from the research areas, as much as they can from the student load areas, and so on, they're competing all the time to maximise their performance. Now, all that's good in some respects, but in a constrained environment such as we're facing at the moment, I think it's not ideal for education programs, for research to deliver answers to big questions and so on. So I'd be looking for more cooperation and more leadership from government to encourage that linkage.
Yes, which wouldn't be such an unusual idea since, you know, in New South Wales, they actually established universities as, you know, the Foundation Act, as Will was speaking about before. So I'll just quickly throw to either James or Will. So this comment about, you know, our new Vice-Chancellor's view, Mark Scott, that University of Sydney and UNSW need to work together more closely, was predicated by him on the fact that that's what happens with Melbourne and Monash. So I just wondered if one of you could perhaps throw in a comment about, does that really work? Or, you know, room for improvement down in Victoria? Will,
Go for it, Will.
looking at you. Oh, Will.
Well, one thing I was going to say was that, you know, I think me and James show in the book that the universities, when they collectively are on the front foot together, they've often been quite effective. And I think that has been demonstrated in Victoria recently, you know, when Melbourne and Monash, for example, have collectively worked with the state government. But even, you know, historically, examples like when, for example, when the universities pursued Menzies to get the, to get reviews and funding and the like looked at for an extended period, it was really when they've been most effective.
Yes, interesting. Now there's another question here. Well, it's throwing the gauntlet down. Is there no need for further government support? Does anyone think there's no need, or do, you know, sort of, is there a chorus here where we can all sing, we need government, more government support?
Well, I'll have a go, Julia. I think we do need more government support, but I'm also pragmatic and realistic about the current economic circumstances facing the nation. And I can't really see an opportunity for a huge shift. So I think the shift has to come in another way, and that is more cooperation between universities.
So anyone else would like to add to that? We have a long question here. Actually, it's a two-part question from one of our PhD students. And the first is for you, Gwilym. You noted that the Australian public has always asserted ownership over Australian universities. And so do you think public perception has changed in any ways in recent years?
So I think, you know, you could say a lot about this, but the quick answer probably is that, you know, the Australian public still do really assert a lot of ownership. We do it constantly, but maybe how they assert it has changed. And I think, you know, the introduction of HECS and more direct student contributions, you know, and how that's developed over the last 30 years is one thing that's really changed the relationship in terms of teaching. But also, you know, even if we think about what's been going on in the last 18 months in terms of the response to the pandemic, you know, a lot is asked of universities, and, you know, that's not something new.
And the second question is for Helen. So your talk ended with the idea of students, primarily boys, pursuing well-paid work instead of further study. What would you say about the historic relationship between work and higher education and its effects on universities?
Look, I probably have two things to say about that. I mean, I think historically and sociologically, it's a really interesting question about the relationship between, you know, institutionalizing young people and having them in the workforce. And so certainly, you know, as you went through the 20th century, you saw the increasing movement of young people into educational institutions for longer and longer periods. And that had all sorts of effects on the family, on the economy. You know, there was a sort of inflation of what sort of credentials you needed for what sort of job. the question, the way it's framed sometimes, that I think is often a very unproductive framing. I think that we often have really bad conversations about the relationship between educational institutions and work, whether it's schools or universities, and this sort of this readiness. You know, I work in teacher education, and there's this often this sort of, I think, unhelpful readiness discourse that is often very instrumental and very narrowing about how we imagine education. And so what I'd like to see in the future are much richer understandings of the sort of relationship between those areas of people's lives, work and education, that isn't just about sort of readiness or a very narrow skills base.
And the possibility, I guess, also for education, you know, in the middle part of your life or latter part of your life.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, that it's not just school, university, yeah, that trajectory. So we also have a question here about what has been the impact of the government's excellence in research assessment ERA program on the distribution and effectiveness of research expenditure within universities. I will open that up to anyone. Just to save us all, I think, you know, Alan, would you have an answer? It just seems, yes, everyone's nodding their heads, but you have to answer.
Okay, I'll try. Look, I can't answer for any individual university at all, because these are deep questions. This is a deep question in terms of how you manage the research profile of any institution. And all leaders within their university should be looking at where the excellence lies. But the ERA exercise covers over a number of other factors which are important in organising research in a university. Namely, where is the emerging strength? Where's the up-and-coming researcher? Where is the up-and-coming field of research, or something like that, which hasn't necessarily been captured in the ERA exercise? So it's difficult. And at the other end of the spectrum, where is a particular area of research beginning not to achieve the outcomes which it really should be delivering? These are difficult questions to answer for an individual university. The final comment I would make here is that the ERA was captured in one of the formulae which was used maybe 10 years ago within the research block grant calculation, but it was such a minor level, and it disturbs me in some regard that the ERA exercise has not been utilised by the government in any overt way in terms of influencing what happens in research across the sector. It's something which, you know, we spend a lot of money on doing the ERA, and a lot of time is spent doing the ERA, but where is it being used? And that's one of the identifying things which I've been looking at in the data analysis I've done. And it's also of interest now, of course, because the provider category standards are now making use of the ERA exercise, where universities, to retain or gain the title of being a university, they have to have world-class research going on in at least 3 disciplines. And that's going to be assessed through the ERA exercise. So that's where it's going to start to have some bite, but I'd like to see it more widely used across the sector.
Thank you. There's a comment here, or part question 2. I did not know this, that apparently some years ago, a Japanese group wanted to buy Sydney University. Did anyone know this? I don't know. And as they understand it, the bid failed as it could not be determined who actually owned Sydney University. So is that relevant to the public-private question? You know, I do know that University of Sydney has a land grant from the government, and it has a Foundation Act. But James, can you add anything to that? Who owns the university?
I'll let James say something in a second, but I think in one sense it's a pretty easy question to answer, that the New South Wales government has control of the institution. To me, the bigger question is, even if they did decide to sell it to any consortium, you know, would that be acceptable? You know, would that be allowed? But I'll pass to James.
I'm not sure I have much to add. This is very much news to me. the question about whether it would be accepted, I think, is an interesting one, Gwil. I think that it goes to questions about what ultimately we want from our universities and whether we are happy to have them operate like a toll road or something like that, that is a sort of public-private consortium, or whether we have we want more control over that and how that operates. I would tend to lean myself against making universities toll roads, but I'm open to be convinced. So.
Look, we have one last question and then we'll have to call it an afternoon, but it's appeared in both the chat and the question box. So there's a question here about whether, Alan, you could comment more on the ethics of subsidising research with the Commonwealth grant. I'm hopeless with acronyms, the CGS, so Commonwealth grant support, and especially with student fees under the Job Ready arrangements. If you could do that very briefly, thanks.
Yeah, Commonwealth funding for student places used to include a component to support research in universities simply on the basis that university education should be founded with the basis of research. So that was the reasoning why some part of Commonwealth funding was allowable to be spent underpinning research activity within the university for every student place. So that's changed a little now with the Job Ready graduates arrangements. So universities are needing to continue doing the research to underpin the education programs, but they've got to find a new way of funding that now.
And there's a very last question here, and it's going to be a quick whip around to everyone. There's a question here. It's a question of scale and size, and whether large universities should large universities look to become specialists, drawing more on and investing more on the areas of research excellence instead of being comprehensive. So a very quick, 3-word answer if you don't mind, and we'll start with you, Helen.
I think it will rely on a lot more leadership from governments at all level, and also a lot more cooperation between universities, that kind of arrangement.
Gwil.
The comprehensive nature of Australian universities has served us pretty well. So while specialisation might be good in some instances, I'm not sure it's always going to be the answer.
James.
I think the question might better be asked about small universities and whether they might specialise, actually, because I think that our large universities have been very successful. Perhaps our small universities might consider that. We've had an example in the past of things like colleges of advanced education and so forth that have been more specialised, that have prospered as well.
And Alan, 2 seconds.
Yeah, I think it goes to the linkages between universities. I'd like to see the big universities continue as comprehensive institutions and the smaller ones become specialists, linking in with the wider comprehensiveness of the larger universities.
Okay, that's wonderful. And thank you to you all today. Thank you to my guests, as well as always to our very appreciative audience. And that brings us to the end of this seminar. A reminder that you can view other seminars in the special online series about Australian universities by searching History of University Life Seminar on either Vimeo or YouTube. We're also in the process of publishing a book with Sydney University Press based on many of these presentations over our now 7 webinars, which will be out next year. And in the meantime, please look out for our special podcasts. The first will be Eora, and the next will be Thinking Culture, and they'll be released very soon. Until next time, wherever you are, farewell, stay safe, stay calm, bye-bye.